Hello, everyone, and welcome to the MIT Sloan CIO Digital Learning Series. So I'm Alan Tate, the Executive Chair, and we have been holding monthly webinars since June, and we will continue to do this through October. The theme of our webinars is Leading a Post-Pandemic Enterprise. And this, today, is episode 4. And we have 2 panels for you today. The first is the increased importance of business continuity and resiliency planning. And the second panel is building the post-pandemic enterprise. So be sure to use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen to ask questions. And with that in mind, let's move to panel number 1. This will be moderated by Naomi Eide. She is a senior editor at CIO Dive. She's focused on the role of the CIO, IT spending, and enterprise-wide cloud strategies. She has a master's in journalism from the University of Maryland, College Park. So please join me in welcoming Naomi Eide. Hi, Naomi.
Hi, thanks so much for having me. Happy Wednesday.
Yeah, same to you. Well, I am looking forward to your panel, and I'm going to leave right now and let you get to it.
Sounds good. Thank you all so much for joining me on the other side of the screen. My name is Naomi Eide. I am the senior editor of CIO Dive and the soon-to-launch Cybersecurity Dive, so look out for that in October. I'm sitting here in an office in North Carolina instead of the Symposium auditorium, which takes place every May. And it's a little bit more comfortable than the auditorium seats, but what we have in front of us is this idea that nothing was as planned. Every conference I plan to go to this year, every conversation I meant to have, all those went to the wayside in favor of the pandemic. And so too, that's the way that enterprises are dealing with businesses and the changing responsibilities that they have in the pandemic, looking really in depth at the people, process, and technology that makes business tick. But now we have extra stressors, and so large-scale transformations had to be delayed in favor of just keeping people up and running. And now, as we start planning for what's next in enterprise, we have to think too about what does resiliency look like moving forward. This will be an ongoing discussion because this was not as planned. Nothing was as planned, and I don't think if anybody sat in their desk, they could really articulate what 2020 would entail. And so as we start this discussion, I want to welcome executives from 3 distinct sectors. For the better part of an hour, we will discuss what does business resiliency mean and what do contingency plans look like in business moving forward. Throughout the discussion, I will be taking questions from those of you on the other side of the screen, the listeners. And so please feel free to message throughout the minute a thought pops into your head. I want to start by welcoming Dr. Aarti Shah. She's the Senior Vice President and Chief Information and Digital Officer at pharmaceutical company Eli Lilly. Reporting directly to Lilly's CEO, Aarti is a key member of the executive committee with more than 26 years of experience. Dr. Shah, thanks so much for joining us. Aarti, it's great to see you.
Great, thanks. I'm happy to be on the panel.
Also with us is Barry Libenson. He's the Global Chief Information Officer for the consumer credit reporting company Experian. Barry has spent nearly 2 decades serving as CIOs in the CIO role across industries for companies including Safeway, Land O'Lakes, and Ingersoll Rand. Barry, welcome.
Hey, good morning, Naomi. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, course. And also joining us is Mark Anderson. He's a Senior Director of Solution Architecture at Equinix. Mark leads Equinix's global solutions architecture organization across Europe, the Middle East, and Africa. He is a 28-year veteran of the IT industry and is focused on transformational strategic IT outsourcing, consulting, systems and services management, and enterprise architecture. Thanks so much for joining us, Mark.
It's a mouthful, Naomi. Happy to be here.
It is a mouthful. EMEA always is. I want to start by opening up with dialogue, and it's slightly different when we're in a virtual setting, but I think it's important to understand how each of you is operating in this pandemic setting. Early on, businesses had to rapidly adopt technology and to support the expansion of remote work, setting aside neatly laid out plans. And suddenly what we're left with is all the plans we once had aren't there, and we need to reevaluate them. So how did the pandemic and the shift to remote work change your business continuity plans? Barry, we can start with you.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think like everyone, we have planned for redundancy and resiliency in all of our systems, but I don't think anyone ever would have predicted that we would have gone from having roughly 2,000 employees VPN'd into the network to having to support 20,000 VPN'd into the network almost overnight. And so, you know, when we looked at business continuity, I think we had to look at it from two angles. First, we had to look at it from the systems that serve our customers. And in that regard, we've always had a very strong capability because of the nature of our business, reliability, and the 4 nines of service is expected by large financial institutions. What was really a big shift for us was for looking at the employee base and how are we going to service 20,000 people and keep them productive, keep systems operating, make sure they had the collaboration tools they needed. That was really the big effort. And, you know, I think I'd say I'm really impressed, not just the way Experian sort of responded to that. I think we did a real job. It took us about 2 weeks really to get everybody fully productive and operational. But just across the industry in general, you know, when I talk to my peers and I talk to other people in the industry, I think this just really did demonstrate how people are really good at rising to a challenge. And, you know, it's not something I want to deal with ever again. But I think that, you know, these shifts make us stronger, make us better. And it now sort of feels like it's business as usual again. And this is the new mode of operation. And a lot of things have definitely changed.
I think we certainly have trends of the before times, the new normal, and what will be the next normal. And I think that's where businesses are really starting to change, is what rearticulating what is that next normal. Artie, how about you? How did the pandemic change your business continuity plans?
Yes, I think you're going to start seeing a similar story over here. But Naomi, first, thanks for having me on the panel. And, you know, for Lilly, I will say that our purpose is really to create medicines that make life better for people around the world. And this has never been more important. And from the earliest days of the pandemic, our approach really and all our decisions have been grounded on 2 pillars. One is employee safety, to make sure the safety and health of our employees. And the other is our ability to be able to make and supply medicines, because we know that millions of people around the world depend on the medicines. So early on in March, when the pandemic hit, right, in a matter of weeks, this meant, as to what, similar to Barry said, it meant moving for us 30,000 plus employees around the world in this work from home environment while keeping the company fully operational. And our IT organization, we call it our Information and Digital Solutions organization, played a very critical role. And in a matter of days and weeks, we went from several thousand VPNing in simultaneous logins to literally seeing on a weekly basis 15,000, 20,000, 25,000 simultaneous logins. And our teams immediately made sure that we were doing everything behind the scenes to strengthen our foundations and the infrastructure to handle the load. In addition to that, Naomi, we made sure that, there was daily stand-ups, daily monitoring of all our critical systems and platforms. Of course, collaboration tools became extremely important, and we needed to make sure that the employees were not only productive, but they also had a great experience, as there were so many other stressors that everybody was dealing with. Very, very proud of all Lilly teammates, all employees, because they leaned in and embraced the new collaboration tools. We were in the process of moving from Skype to Teams, and our Teams adoption like skyrocketed. Means I think it was over a 1,500% increase over the few months and weeks that we started going fully virtual. So just to share some of the things we did.
Yeah. And Mark, for you, this is a different challenge. I mean, yes, there's employees involved, but also we're talking about physical infrastructure. If this goes down, all these companies that come to rely on it, the financial services, the healthcare, everything, they're impacted. And so how has the pandemic affected Equinix?
Yeah, it was kind of a twofold situation. One was, of course, dealing with the pandemic itself, and then the other was dealing with the impact of the pandemic in the sense that many of our customers were busy trying to ramp up to deal with the demands that Artie and Barry are just mentioning there in the enterprise. So, of course, Equinix was very, the two primary things that we were interested in right away was the health and safety of our customers and partners and employees and the continuity of our services. And they were linked together because since our IBXs are, which is our term for data centers, are identified as essential businesses or critical infrastructure by local governments, and they need to remain open, they need to remain up. We wanted to ensure that they were prioritized through the whole course of the pandemic and the lockdowns and the issues related to that. And we wanted them to remain operational. So that meant putting precautionary measures in place to minimize the risk to the operational impact and protect the health and safety of our operations teams in the 250 data centers that we have around the world. And that meant that we had to implement new standard operating procedures very quickly, including an appointment-based system to control the timing and frequency of customer visits. We also encouraged our customers to leverage certain services remotely so that they didn't have to come into the data center and therefore risk a potential contamination situation. We had a very strict screening policy with a hygiene policy that was put in place very quickly, and that minimization of the risk of transfer between different kind of employee bubbles really helped our situation and been able to keep key workers in key positions in the key data centers. As far as the rest of the teams were concerned, we already had a robust set of collaboration tools, laptop, Zoom, Teams, Slack, SharePoint, Box, multi-factor authentication, cloud-based apps. We already had all of those things in place. But I would say that the thing that changed was it required all of our teams to do everything they normally did, but in a new way sometimes. So, for example, our sales teams meeting with customers and our marketing teams changing their campaigns to 100% online and digital. That was, a really big change. And the company continues to have a policy where all our corporate offices are closed. They were closed back in March. We're still in a work from home mode. We've got a phased plan announced for returning back to the office right now, and where local conditions allow, we're progressing through that. And we also decided right away to limit employee travel. So again, that was a decision made back in March, where we would postpone or virtualize every single global event we did until at least the end of January 2021.
Yeah, and this actually goes back to something I wanted to speak with Artie about as well. You're in pharmaceuticals, there's actual processes that I can't even imagine, but it requires in-person, people have to be together to do some of that or work in labs or whatnot. Can you talk a little bit about what Lilly has done to continue operations in what is, again, a critical field and in the development of something that might be able to help the pandemic?
Sure. So there are multiple questions over here, and I'll try to point to that. So first, as I shared, from the earliest days of the pandemic, all our decisions were grounded on these two pillars, right? Our ability to keep the employees safe and healthy, and our ability to continue to make and supply medicines because patients across the world, around the world, depend on it. And I'll tell you the first in terms of with the pandemic, right? Means Lilly being one of the pharma companies, we needed to attack and address the pandemic right in the beginning. And we brought, I would say, our full scientific, medical, and technology prowess to bear to assist public health efforts in our own home state of Indiana, helping Indiana accelerate diagnostic testing for the virus. Okay. If you think about, let's go back in March, right? There was a dire need of testing sites, as well as, once you get the swabs done, you need the diagnostic that could test as to whether you're positive or negative. And so what Lilly did was, in less than 3 weeks in the state of Indiana at our headquarters, we did two things. We launched a drive-through testing facility and the diagnostic testing lab. We stood both of these two things up in less than 3 weeks to help the state analyze tests taken in healthcare facilities across the state. And over, I would say, in the first 3 months itself, our scientists tested more than 60,000 samples before recently transitioning these efforts back to the state. This required for us, we needed to create COVID-19 like testing portals for patient registrations, volunteering, scheduling, and patient results, while also setting up a call center operation to register and schedule patients for testing. And the technology means its underpinning played a key role. So that's in terms of addressing the very near need that was there. Then the second piece, what Lilly has done is, existing Lilly medicines that are currently being studied to understand the potential in treating complications of COVID-19. And we are also collaborating with two biotech companies to discover novel antibody treatments for COVID-19. And if there's interest, I can go a little bit in detail over here. These are the first human trials anywhere in the world. We announced that, I think, back in June. Again, these are done in collaboration with NIAID, which is the National Institute of Allergy and Infection Diseases. But to kind of come up with a treatment with the antibody treatment, and we have a couple of studies that are currently ongoing in phase 2 and phase 3.
Yeah, and it's interesting in advanced and rapid science, and with that, it illuminates the need of technology throughout, the need to access the data, the need for everything to just work. Therefore, it doesn't serve as an interruption. And one thing I've noticed throughout the pandemic is we've talked about for years, we've talked about CIOs getting a seat at the table, CIOs becoming part of the executive committee, CIOs being able to really speak about ongoing business problems and articulate business goals and using technology to advance them. And I think that it also means that IT has played a very, very important part in IT resilient or in business resiliency planning. And I want to talk a little bit about this. When we are thinking about what to do moving forward with businesses and make next term plans, how is IT working with other stakeholders, IT and the engineering department and all of that? How are they working with other stakeholders to kind of shape what is going to be the next generation of these companies? Barry, let's start with you.
Yeah. So Experian has always really been a technology-driven company. So, I've been with the firm now a little over 5 years, and really have always had a seat at the table. It was one of the things that I was looking for, and the company was looking for when I joined. And technology sort of drives all of our decision making, and whether it's my organization controlling core platforms that the businesses consume, whether it's partnering with the businesses to create a hybrid cloud strategy that will work in any on any infrastructure in any data center environment. The truth of the matter is that what the pandemic has done is force us even closer to the business than we were before. We've always had that. It's actually, there are a lot of things that we probably have done over the last 6 months with the business that impactful, but that we probably wouldn't have done if it hadn't been for the pandemic. So, a real simple example is, when we only had 2,000 or 3,000 people working from home, implementing things like split tunneling across the network isn't really that big a deal. When you have tons of capacity on your VPN, you don't worry about people consuming it. When all of a sudden you go from 2,000 to 20,000 almost overnight, you have to look at very rapid ways of reclaiming bandwidth and making sure that customers aren't disrupted, allowing Scrum teams to continue to work together in the development process. And that really has brought us much closer together with business and sort of forced us to look at things. And again, I think, Mark had mentioned some of these things. And, as a customer of Mark's, they do a great job for us. So we operate in their data centers, we operate in our own data centers. And one of the big issues was exactly what he talked about, is, we don't want people going into the data center right now. I don't want people going to Mark's facilities. I don't want people going into my own facilities unless they absolutely have to, because of the pandemic. And so sort of coordinating and figuring out how to work more closely with the business to ensure that, there's no disruption as a result of all of this was really top of mind. And, continues to be a focus. I honestly believe that we'll actually be a better organization when we come out of this as a result of it than we were when we went in. We've improved a lot of things, both from a process perspective and a technology perspective, in direct response to the pandemic. And I think that that's really sort of made us a better organization for it.
Does that hold true for you and Artie and Mark? Will your organization be better following the pandemic in terms of operations and how you approach business problems?
Oh, absolutely. Means I agree with what Barry said, and means having a seat at the table, having been sitting right at the executive committee means with all the different business leaders, we are so very well integrated. We have also seen remarkable productivity, improved productivity. Things that would have taken us years. We have done several things in a matter of months. Of course, the sense of urgency is very different right now, and it's a death and life and death situation. But absolutely, we are looking at that right now to say what have we seen? You cannot, as our CEO says, you cannot unsee what you have seen in the last 6 months. But at the same time, you'll have to balance it with other things too, to make sure when we are all together, what are the positives of that, and how do you get the most out of both worlds?
Yeah, indeed. I think one of the things that's been interesting is that this has been a forced test of many of the things we've discussed in theory before. For example, if we take a workforce and we make them remote, what's the impact upon, for example, productivity? What's the impact upon meeting customer requirements? Can we still run a business like that if we had to do that? And of course, we've gone 100% to that model. But is there somewhere in between where we can use less of the Earth's resources for travel and other things, that we can do more related to the remote styles of working, give people in our organizations a better work-life balance, to be able to manage their lives without having to necessarily commute all the time, etc. So these aspects have all played through in our planning and in real life through the course of this pandemic, and certainly have led to some important takeaways about the right mix of productivity and work and life.
Yeah, and I think something that rings true throughout this, the thread that connects it all, is the people. And it's cliche, but it's accurate. People, process, technology. And I think we've figured out the technology part. We've done that for months now. And really, I think it's come down to people. And a lot has been impacting people. There's been with schools closed, there's unplanned for homeschooling, there's health concerns and ensuing caretaking responsibilities. And then there's also, and especially in the US, there's a social justice movement as well. And I think it's causing a lot of turmoil at that employee desk. And so can you talk a little bit about, as technology business leaders, how have you helped navigate the impacts on people in the pandemic? How have you dealt with that?
I can start, Naomi, if you want me to that. Mm-hmm. Want me to start?
Sure, go ahead, please.
Sure, but I think this is one of the most important questions, and people always and will always be the foundation of the house that we stand on, right? And the emotional well-being, the mental well-being of our own self and of our employees is of the highest priority. Because what also comes along with this stuff is managing in a new remote way the workforce, and additional efforts have to be put in place. And we have put in a lot of additional efforts. Our employee resource groups have done a variety of different lunch and learn sessions, the virtual check-ins that are important, additional ergonomic needs, allowances for ergo needs, ensuring people are not working too much and are not stretched too thin. They're taking the time off. We are also encouraging people to say, take your vacation days, leverage your vacation days, and we model that all the way through. I think you touched on another important point, especially in the United States, and then it went across with George Floyd's death on May 25th, that galvanized the country and has ignited an awakening to racial injustice around the world. And we have seen unprecedented interest from people wanting to get active in that, engaged and involved in helping to create the change that we all want to see. So we needed to make sure that we were addressing those emotional challenges that were also going on. As a leader, you asked the question, means each one of us has a role to play, while society has a role to play, CD management has a role to play, each and every one of us has a role to play to make sure that our teams feel safe. Within my organization, we held supervisor discussions and panels to have these uncomfortable conversations. They are uncomfortable, but we needed to start and have some of these candid, honest conversations with the whole racial injustice on that topic. And then in a matter of 3 weeks, I wanted to learn more. So had 50 one-on-ones with Black colleagues within my own organization, one-on-ones, to really understand what were some of their lived experiences, what are some of their challenges, and it is helping us to put interventions in place, certain things in place that will make it a better place and hopefully will make it a better society too.
Yeah, just to follow up with Arti's point there, we've actually done many similar things in our organization. The company has a globally adopted mantra, which is I'm safe, I belong, and I matter. And they're just not words. They're really touchstones in which we shape policy across all levels of the organization. And talking specifically to the kind of situation and the impact on work-life balance with COVID-19, we've a company-wide adoption of a kind of a lo-fi Wednesday. We call it a better way day, where meetings are avoided to kind of give some relief from Zoom fatigue. We've instituted shorter meeting times across the board. We've company-wide mandated a public holiday shutdown to create an extra long weekend in October to give us some decompression time as a business. And just to talk to some of the kind of points that Arti was mentioning there related to social justice and particularly inequality and prejudice. At the beginning of 2020, our CEO, Charles Myers, established the Diversity, Inclusion and Belonging Working Group to drive a DIB agenda across the company. And that was foundational to our values, and it's a key part of who we are as a company and how we want to show up. And we formalized and expanded an Allies Council, which is kind of a group of 30 leaders across the company dedicated to embedding diversity, inclusion and belonging and everything that we do and creating that as a culture. And that led to a series of events across the course of the year. On the 25th of February, we held Days of Understanding, where 2,600 of our colleagues signed up to participate in important conversations about inclusivity at Equinix. Throughout COVID, our Equinix Women's Leadership Network ran a full program of events related to career development and fireside chats and wellness sessions. And then it culminated on something that was really important for us. On the 23rd of June, we ran a global 24-hour internal event called We Connect, which focused on courageous conversations, learning, well-being, celebration of equality and diversion and connection. And that was a day that lasted literally from sunrise to sunset, a 24-hour period where the whole global community of Equinix came together to have those conversations. And It's also led to a series of employee connection networks across Equinix, Pride Connect, Black Connect, Genta Connect, and the Veterans Network, etc., which we're really proud of, and it continues to further the conversations that we need to have both as a company and also as a community.
Mm.
So I can hit on a couple of points. Mark actually did a very. I could just take a lot of the things that Mark said, and we've done a lot of very similar things. We went to a no meeting Friday policy because, like everybody, I mean, I can't speak for everybody, but the number of phone calls and Zoom and WebEx meetings and team meetings, it's almost become overwhelming because that's the new, you don't have the ability to do drive-bys anymore in the office. And so everything's kind of come down to either a video call or a phone call. I will say this is an area that really concerns me because I think initially everybody was really actually excited about the prospects of being able to work from home. And we send out surveys almost every 2 weeks to the entire employee population to get a sense for people's well-being, state of mind. And the initial survey results were extremely positive. 85, 90% of the people were very pleased with the way we were handling the situation. We've always placed employee health first. And they, this novel idea of being able to work from home was new and kind of cool for a lot of people. That's not so true anymore. People the survey results continue to be very positive, but they're very much trending now, very slowly, but they are trending back towards lower levels of comfort working from home. And I think some of that stems from the fact that a lot of us have kids that have gone back to school very recently. And so our lives are, we want to return to some sense of normalcy, and it's very, very difficult. So we'll continue to do these surveys at a very high rate just to get a sense. The other thing I think is it's easy to forget about people or not forget about them, but if you're married with a family and you're, working from home, you have a social structure in your house that provides you with companionship and people to speak with. Those employees that are single right now are very much struggling. And I think that's something that we have to remember because they don't necessarily, maybe they have a pet or maybe they have friends, but they're not having the same level of social interaction that people with families are having. And so that's something we're also. So, with regard to the social justice thing, this is an area that's very near and dear to my heart. I happen to be the parent of two biracial children, and I'm the executive sponsor of our what we call our Caribou ERG group. So we have a number of employee resource groups inside of Experian around social causes, and a lot of the same types of things that Mark sort of mentioned. We sponsor different types of events, and obviously things have been very active recently in light of the civil unrest that we're seeing in different parts of the country and actually different parts of the world. So, we take that stuff, very seriously. It's something that the whole company engages in. I think this is clearly one of those cases where it's really hard to say you've done enough. It's such a new concept for all of us, but I'm very just really moved by a lot of the activity, and it really feels like this time is a little different from times in the past. So, we're very engaged in that at Experian, and think it's a very important cause.
And I think part of it too is it's a completely shared experience. And at least that's what we're in my seat. I live in Washington, D.C., and I'm sitting here in North Carolina right now. But even here, it's the same stressors, the same pressures, the same kind of that reaction of looking in the mirror. And that's what your employees are going through. That's what you are going through. And it causes us to really rearticulate what is important to a business. What are the underlying problems? And you have to think through, like, what does ideation look like in a pandemic? We used to whiteboard. We used to have those casual conversations. We cannot do that anymore. And so do we try to replicate it? Do we try to adapt to a new tool set? Do we just get yet another tool for the problem? And these are all every single day what business leaders are dealing with. But it also takes us to another problem, money. Forrester is projecting now a steep tech downturn in this year and into 2021, with tech budgets dropping 6% from last year's levels and continued small declines in 2021. That is one of their scenarios, but they say it's the most likely. It requires companies to build flexible plans for expanding and reversing tech budget cuts depending on economic performance. Well, how do you plan for something like that? Because if you need to have all these new tools, if you need to have something that can help your employees, and you also need to cut, how are you navigating that?
Yeah, I can take a whack at this one, Naomi. So I think I'm probably like a lot of people on this call or a lot of people that are watching. We always place our badged employees first and foremost inside the organization. And we use a fair number of contractors like a lot of firms do. And so we looked at a couple of things. First of all, we did a lot of planning around different scenarios and actually had a game plan in place to address, any possible scenario as a result of the pandemic. We obviously were forecasting that EBIT and some of our numbers would be down, just like everybody was doing. We looked at the workforce and sort of determined how we would have to address that if it came to fruition. With the focus being on retaining employees. And so, one of the first things we all agreed was that, the entire organization, we didn't do any merit increases for this fiscal year. Because that allowed us to save quite a few employees. I mean, normally we would do merit increases around April. We all decided to forego that, including the entire executive staff. And so that allowed us to retain employees. We made cuts around contractors where they were not viewed as essential workers. And that allowed us to retain employees. And also the other thing, and this is public knowledge because we came out yesterday or the day before and announced it. The results were actually better. We haven't seen sort of the worst case scenario that we had anticipated. Things have actually been quite strong. But you raised a lot of other good points, and how do you adapt to ideation, and how do you keep the organization sort of moving forward? And I don't think it's a case of simply doing what you were doing a different way. I do think that you have to sort of adapt to this, especially in an agile world, where you're so used to people interacting so directly, developers with business people, with product managers, those kinds of situations. We have sort of set up new processes and new tools to make that easier, more streamlined, to replace the capabilities that we had when we were face to face. So there's been a lot of adjustment, both in terms of how we look at the workforce and how we work as a result of the pandemic. And now it kind of feels like we're in a good place and we're not making big changes any longer. There's sort of small, minor adjustments. And I would expect that to sort of continue through the remainder of the calendar year, but pretty much to be steady state by the time we hit 21.
I mean, for us at Lilly, we are clearly seeing an increased demand for technology, data, and advanced analytics, high performance computing, no question about it. But as you say, right, clearly we cannot invest at the rate at which the business is demanding tech investments, otherwise we'll break the bank, right? So it forces us to kind of say, how do we become more and more cost effective and efficient, and a variety of different stuff in addition to what Barry said, right? And also we have to support new business models that are emerging, means how we interact with customers, the digital channels through which we can interact with customer, the growth in elements, means we are seeing a number of new business models that are coming. So we are looking at traditional and non-traditional ways. And what I mean by traditional ways is within how we used to operate IT means, of course, and again, for a company that has been 145-year plus old, right, means we have a lot of legacy systems in place. So how do we modernize the technology stack? How do we go have the cloud first strategy, machine first strategy? How do we become a platform company? We are looking at full app rationalization and things like that, licenses. Procurement helps us significantly because we, again, work with many collaborators and partners, and they are part of helping us solve the problem. We are looking at, what's the role of automation all the way from RPA to advanced automation, and how can we get better business efficiencies through all of these things. And then I would say, traditionally, so if you think about the commercial world of how marketing is done traditionally, there may be different ways of now how we spend and through digital channels, and that is transitioning or flowing that money in a different direction, but actually getting more return on investment. So there are a variety of different things that we are looking at and working on to continue to become more and more cost effective, more productive, and create that room to reinvest in more emerging modern technologies and advanced analytics.
We're way past, I think, the stage where most people are thinking about IT just simply as an efficiency engine inside of an organization. In many cases, IT is the business of the organization. And, we have to remember that, like every other funding decision that we make, there has to be a good return on investment for that. But clearly, when some people are cutting spending in IT, we hope that what they're doing is they're cutting spending in the places where they really, aren't going to deliver that return on investment in the time that they're looking to return that, and rather diverting that spending to areas of the business which makes that business a stronger and more agile business in the future. I was reading an article in the World Economic Forum about supply chains, and the basic premise of the article was that many supply chains are not well understood. They're too complex, and quite often they're underpinned by paper contracts. In a world with COVID and in a world with agility and digitalization in mind, we can clearly see that there are opportunities for many organizations, for example, who deal with complex supply chains, to start thinking about new ways of doing that, to start thinking about a highly, optimized digitalization strategy around that, start looking at technologies like blockchain, start looking at technologies like IoT, to start trying to understand how we can bring these things together. So I would say that I'm hoping that organizations who are cutting their spending are doing so with the view of making sure that spending goes into the most appropriate places. When I think about Equinix, we've seen, an awful lot of stuff happening around our environment. Digital businesses rely on interconnection services to support business critical operations, usually because they're having interactions with multiple networks, with multiple clouds, and with multiple digital value chain partners. And when we think about that kind of dynamic shift, the kind of work that we're investing in is really to optimize how our customers can do that in a more dynamic and agile way, to do that as a software-enabled way, to change our platform from what is effectively an infrastructure play towards that which is a software-defined infrastructure play. And that underpinning infrastructure is going to be needed to support those types of applications that require that kind of on-demand agility to support what our customers want to do. Through the case of COVID, we saw international traffic on our network spike to incredible levels. One of our customers, which is the largest internet exchange in Europe, hit an all-time high on the 26th of March of 9.1 terabits per second of throughput through that particular one site. And to give you an idea, that's like 2 million video downloads simultaneously going through that particular IX at that moment. And the second biggest internet exchange in Europe similarly saw 8 terabits per second at the same time. So we're seeing these massive increases in interconnection requirements across the business. And from our perspective, that's good for us because, of course, that's our business. We stated recently that our interconnection revenues were rising at a double-digit rate, and through the course of quarter two, we actually added 8,000 extra interconnections, even during the time of this lockdown. And that was all fueled by streaming, video traffic, enterprise cloud connectivity traffic. So my sense is that CIOs of the companies that I work with are making decisions about prioritization of spending in the right places.
Yeah, and I think that's been a change of tune. It's not just cutting and then we get to give it back to the business. It's let's cut and reinvest. And that's a big transition for companies across sectors. And I think there's been that appetite for this is what we get if we are better about digitalization of business processes and that sense of digital transformation, which is a bit overdone, but really let's just call it modernization. Like the cloud-based systems that are becoming the de facto standard in enterprise, they're important and they make business a lot more flexible. If this pandemic had happened 3 to 5 years ago, would we have continued to operate as we have now? And so I think there's been this understanding that technology has supported businesses throughout, and that's important to tell stakeholders. I want to talk a little bit about the executive leadership skills that have been really tested and what you've had to adapt to, because I think throughout this pandemic, we're also talking about what you as people are dealing with, just as we talked about employees earlier. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about what you individually have learned and what you've tried to apply personally in terms of leadership.
So I'll start off with a key word here, which would be empathy. And I will acknowledge I do not have a reputation for being the most empathetic person, but I will tell you I have learned empathy skills quite significantly over the last several months. I mean, just the human interaction of reaching out to people on a regular basis and making sure that everybody's just doing okay has really become a critical skill almost. Just sort of making sure that you're touching all points of the organization on a regular basis and getting to everyone, has been a pretty big change in management style because, again, you don't have the ability to do the drive-bys. Normal meetings aren't necessarily happening the way they did. All the events that you would normally see people at have either been postponed or are being done virtually with a different audience. So just sort of personal style change. I'll also tell you, I've attended more virtual happy hours in the last 6 months than I probably have in the last 6 years. So just, sitting in front of a tube like this, watching somebody play the piano or the guitar during a 4 to 5 o'clock happy hour on Fridays. I mean, there's probably 6 or 7 different organizations every Friday doing that now inside of Experian. People are doing some very creative things and adapting to sort of make this enjoyable and to try to see, to try to find a silver lining. And I think that's really great. Like I said, the other is recognizing people like, I think it's really touching when I'm on a video call and somebody's dog or cat jumps up on the table or somebody's kids walk in the background and people, I'm glad people have stopped apologizing for that because I think it's incredibly endearing and it shows you another side of people that you wouldn't normally have gotten to see. So there are some positives, I think, from this that we need to recognize as well.
I will add, Naomi, 3 words to what Barry said to his empathy. And I would say the EQ part is extremely important. Empathy is part of emotional quotient. But the IQ and EQ, especially in times of this, means vulnerability. We as leaders, when we are vulnerable, we share our challenges. We all have been impacted emotionally, mentally, physically. And when I have shared that, people feel okay. They have the permission to open up and see it. And that human to human touch is just there are no words to put around it. I mean, that goes a long, long way. So in these times, I would say the EQ part of it being vulnerable. Second is fun. And we are all so much business driven. We wouldn't be in our roles, right, if we were not delivering and having that. But that element of fun and the humanness needs to be in there. Every leadership meeting, we have some fun thing. And it's interesting to see the creativity of the teams, your organization, and when you do it. And the third piece I would add is resiliency. I've seen unbelievable resiliency. It could be driven because of commitment, loyalty, all that stuff, but resiliency all around the team. And resilient people, right, they embrace adversity as an opportunity to grow, build on their strengths and develop coping strategies in different ways. We share the coping strategies. And when we build resiliencies for our own self, then I feel that we are also in a position to then do something and be a support structure and help our teams too. So those are the three things I would add.
I think Barry and Artie has really touched on all the main highlights there for me as well. One thing's for sure, we've definitely had to develop a sense of humour through this whole situation. And, dealing with the mental health of ourselves, our families and our colleagues, and the well-being of our teams certainly can be a challenge. And it's very difficult sometimes as a leader of a person who perhaps breaks down in tears on a call because it's just gotten too much. And what do you say? How do you deal with it? And I think what it's allowed us to do is it's allowed us to deal with things with a lot more humanity than perhaps we might have done before. Because it might have been easier just to deal with the hard facts of the numbers rather than actually deal with what's going on behind the person, behind the camera. And for me, that's one of the biggest takeaways out of all of this is really just at the end of the day, we're all just the same people trying to do the same thing, which is just to get on in the world and make a better place for ourselves in our future. And we shouldn't forget that.
Yeah, I really appreciate that because I think the person is what we're finding is making business tick, and the person, the individual, and figuring out how to make that a safe working environment, given that, my office is my bedroom and there's not much flexibility there, and figuring out a new way to operate and a new way to just be every day is important. In the last few minutes, we had some questions come in from the audience, and they touch on people largely. Prior to the pandemic, we'd often hear about challenges with finding or retaining tech talent. Has that changed? Are you experiencing any different tech workforce challenges now, especially given that IT engineering and data workers are as important as if not more important than before?
I think what I learned is, now that work can be done from anywhere, means how work gets done, who gets work done. That has opened up actually more degrees of freedom from that perspective. From a tech talent perspective, the fact that at least at Lilly, we actually continued with our internship program. Yes, it was virtual, but the feedback that we got even from future recruits from campus perspective, very, very positive. So I've not seen personally any challenges in terms of being able to recruit talent, retain talent. And as we are creating additional centers of excellence outside of the United States, we continue to see increased interest across the board.
I think tech talent in general and getting the right people has always been a difficult thing to do, and COVID certainly hasn't helped. And I would just say that at the end of the day, organizations like Artie's and Barry's, hopefully ourselves as well, represent organizations which are fundamentally talking a different conversation with employees and potential employees, which is, one where, we hope that they can see value in the thing that we do and who we are, not just that it's a place to come, and build some experience and draw a paycheck. And I think that it's important for all organizations, specifically those hiring tech talent, but probably anyone hiring any kind of talent, to talk to the values that we discussed earlier on about I'm safe, I belong, I matter, for example. That these are really core elements to really what attracts good talent. It's that's kind of, for me, the more important aspect to kind of play on.
So I think 3 or 4 months ago, you were seeing very little movement in the workforce. Either you weren't seeing employees, leaving. We had very low turnover, and we also weren't doing a lot of recruiting because we were waiting to see how things were going to play out. If I fast forward to where we are today, excuse me, I would say that things have sort of returned to a more sense of normal. Not the same accelerated rate of hiring or employee turnover, but it's sort of a reduced level that's at a normal cadence right now. The one area I would call an exception to is around security talent. I think that the pandemic has created a super high demand for really talented security people. There was always a demand for those kinds of individuals. I think this has heightened it. And I think that security people in general, especially, in the financial services space or in pharma where IP protection is really critical, or in data center operations, those people are going to be highly sought after. So we are having to do some things to sort of look at, our security people. So it's the one area that I would say has become a little bit of a challenge. But other than that, I think things have kind of gotten back to a normal sense of talent retention and talent acquisition.
Well, I so appreciate it. And unfortunately, we've hit the mark in time, and I will have to bid you all adieu. But I really thank you for this insightful conversation. I think we've learned that throughout, it's people. Among other things, technology is important, but really on top of it, it's about making sure you understand your employee base. So again, Barry, Artie, and Mark, thank you so much for joining us this morning. Hope to talk to you all again in the future and maybe shake your hand one day.
Employees depend on a high-performing digital workplace more than ever. It lies at the core of your business's competitive advantage and employee morale. Yet, ironically, optimizing their digital experience has never been harder. Over the past decade, IT has had to deal with the disrupting emergence of mobile, SaaS, and cloud computing. Now, with the post-COVID-19 new normal taking hold, analysts are predicting a dramatic rise in remote workers. This adds a host of last-mile service delivery issues for IT to contend with, when suddenly employees are no longer located in IT-controlled corporate office environments, but are distributed in unreliable home offices. It is crucial that IT optimizes employees' digital experience and dexterity. Unfortunately, IT is ill-equipped to optimize employee experience. First, existing tools have many blind spots. They can see your local area network, your data center infrastructure, and, with application performance monitoring, even your application code. But they are blind to everything in between. Most tools are especially blind to SaaS applications, which your employees increasingly rely on. Furthermore, these tools are reactive. They only alert you to employee experience issues after the fact. IT needs early warning, when there is still time to fix the problem before your employees notice. Catchpoint can help. We're an end-to-end monitoring solution that provides complete visibility into everything that affects your employees' digital experience. Here's how it works. We start with complete end-to-end visibility with no blind spots. This includes wireless and cable routers, last-mile vendors, backbone transits, data center, cloud, and SaaS apps. This 360-degree monitoring, combined with advanced analytics, helps IT diagnose and repair problems quickly. To that, we add the ability to proactively identify issues before they impact employee productivity. Catchpoint's active monitoring watches your employees' digital experience from a comprehensive, holistic network of vantage points. Advanced on-premises locations that monitor from inside the firewall. The industry's most complete global network of public locations. On your employees' endpoints, providing the industry's only proactive employee device monitoring. And in every nook of the digital wilderness that lies between your employees' endpoint and the applications they rely on. All of these monitoring components give IT unprecedented visibility into everything that affects employee experience. But Catchpoint also provides deep, real-time analytics that help IT quickly and accurately diagnose problems. With Catchpoint, IT finally has the solution to manage and optimize employee experience with proactive insights that spot problems before your employees do, before it hurts productivity. Catchpoint, advancing employee experience in the digital workplace.
That was an excellent panel, and thanks to Naomi, Barry, Artie, and Mark. I really enjoyed it, and I especially like the focus on the human side of things as we deal with COVID-19. And Naomi, thanks for your work in preparing for the panel and being our moderator. So now it's on to the second part of our webinar. This is panel number 2. This is Building the Post-Pandemic Enterprise. And this is going to be co-moderated by Rodney Zemmel and James Manyika. And but we're going to start with a short presentation from Rodney. So let me introduce him to get us started. He is the global leader of McKinsey Digital, based out of their New York office. Rodney serves clients across industries on growth strategy, performance improvement, and value creation by harnessing the power of data and analytics, digital culture and capabilities, and modernizing core technology. Rodney's a recognized thought leader on these topics, including published work in the Harvard Business Review. And he is the co-author of the book, Go Long: Why Long-Term Thinking is Your Best Short-Term Strategy. Please join me in welcoming Rodney Zemmel.
Thank you, Alan, and thank you everybody who's taking part today. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm Rodney Zemmel. I'm the global leader of McKinsey Digital, and I'm going to talk about building the post-pandemic enterprise. So today, I'm going to start by talking about consumer behavior and how has consumer behavior changed in the light of COVID. And the reason we're going to talk about that is because we need to talk about what does post-pandemic really mean, right? What do we think is going to happen out there in the world? Then we'll talk about the shifts in company behavior. And obviously there's a lot in that. So we'll click down on business-to-business selling as an example. And then we'll step back and talk about what this means for the post-pandemic enterprise overall. And specifically, what does this mean for the role of the CIO and the digital transformation initiatives that the CIO is trying to drive in the post-pandemic enterprise? And then we'll turn to our panel for Q&A. So if we want to start with some consumer behavior. So what this chart shows is credit card data since the beginning of this year and what people are spending, what consumers are spending in different categories. And you can see the light blue line at the top here. That's grocery and food store. So that's the one category, the most essential category there is, that is the only category that is really up in consumer spending behavior since the beginning of the year. Pretty much everything else, whether it's health, general merchandise, entertainment, transportation, is down. And while in April, May, it looked like it was a rapid recovery, the pace of the recovery has actually slowed since then. In fact, our data says optimism about a rapid recovery has decreased from about 44% in March to about 32% now in July. Why am I sharing this? I'm sharing this because the post-pandemic enterprise will be characterized not only by our changes in behavior driven by the virus, but also by our changes in behavior driven by the economy. It's very clear that we're going to be in very different economic times towards the end of this year than we were towards the end of last year. If we move on and we look at behavior by category. So groceries at the top of the page here was the category where people were spending the least time, or among the categories where people were spending the least time at the beginning of the pandemic or pre-pandemic. 24% of people were doing most of their purchasing online. There's a 60% increase in that since the start of the pandemic. If you take another category, books, towards the bottom of this page, so books, 67% were being bought online at the beginning of the pandemic. I guess I was one of the few who's still in that 33% who prefers to go into a real bookshop. But what we're seeing is even that category is going even further online. And what this page is intended to show is the change in behavior in every category between 15 and 45% of how digital has been accelerated. So it's already become a cliche about how the recovery from COVID-19 will be digital, but it's quite striking to look at the data by category and to see how we've had many years of digital acceleration in just a few months during the pandemic. If we move on and then say, what does it mean about changes in loyalty behavior? So this is some fairly recent data that we've analyzed that says 3 out of 4 Americans have tried a new shopping behavior and they intend to continue it. This is pretty dramatic. So 43% have tried a new shopping method, 75% say they like it and they're going to continue it. On average, that means people who weren't online who are now going to be online. But here's the new news, a different brand. 37% of people have tried a different brand. They're overwhelmingly satisfied. Similarly, a different retailer, a private label, and so on. What we see is there's actually been more disruption in consumer shopping behaviors and the choices people are making than we've seen for many, many years. And most people say they're pretty happy with it and they intend to continue. So what we're seeing is not just an acceleration of digital, but also a huge amount of new choice being introduced into the markets. Arguably, there's no time better than now to be a new product or a new brand launching if you can tap into this new consumer moment. And arguably, there's no time tougher if you're an established brand and you've been supply chain challenged. If we move on, and let's talk about what this means for our personal behaviors. So what this chart shows is looking up on the vertical axis is user growth since the beginning of COVID. And the horizontal axis asks the question, how much do you intend to use it after COVID? And obviously this is survey data, so we'll see if it really plays out this way. But for example, remote learning, you can clearly see is a little bit of a, let's call it a necessary evil, right? It's gone up enormously in use, more than 100% since COVID. But less than half the people say they actually want to stay with remote learning. And it's a smaller number than that who want to stay with it as their primary method going forward. Telemedicine could be in that category also, a huge increase in telemedicine. And depending on what it's for, there are different choices then about whether people want to stay with it going forward or not. In contrast, social media, online streaming, digital exercise, wellness apps, cooking regularly, TikTok, obviously there's a lot more we could say about TikTok. These are shifts that people say are here to stay and they're likely to continue beyond COVID. So it's interesting to look at this and say on the prior pages when we looked at how spending was changing and how loyalty was changing, this tells us how habits are changing. This is, of course, a consumer view. And what we're going to talk about now is what does this mean about corporate habits and company habits and how are they going to change? So if we move forward then to talk about companies, we'll actually start with business-to-business selling. So why am I picking remote selling as an example? So before the pandemic, the digitization of B2C selling was very well established, right? Everybody saw it as the future. However, in business-to-business selling, it was much earlier days. On average, business-to-business selling is a much more complicated, much more multi-stakeholder process. On average, it's a longer process. And there's many different roles involved between who places the order and who's the actual decision maker and so on. So conventional wisdom has been it's been much harder to digitize. And while it is harder to digitize, the pace of change in the last 3 months has been enormous. You're probably all aware of that. But maybe what's more surprising is how much your customers are actually happy with digitized business-to-business selling. So our data here is from a survey of about 1,300 people who've tried buying things remotely in the business-to-business world. And on average, they prefer it. Why do they prefer it? It's easier to schedule. It's more efficient. It's faster. Sometimes there's assumptions about better price. Often there's assumptions about better technical support or better service or responsiveness. And in fact, when you step back and you say, do you want this to stay? 50% of people say they actually don't want to see your customer sales representative ever. Now, that's what they're saying. I'd be surprised if the behavior shift is really as dramatic as that. But if the behavior shift is even a half or a third as dramatic as that, that means some very profound things for how companies sell to each other. So let's talk about what those profound changes might look like. So we think right now we're in generation 1.0 of digital selling. And what that means is taking how selling was done in person and moving it online. So meetings like this that happen by video that would have been in person, or automating the transactional parts of the process, or e-commerce and digital marketing from B2C and with the analytics that goes with it applied to a B2B environment with a similar set of sort of traditional selling metrics. But what we're beginning to see is what we're calling Generation 2.0 in B2B selling. And this has a few characteristics whose relevance is going to vary a little bit by industry. So first of all, immersive experiences, whether it's AR or VR, or whether it's still on a flat screen but in a much more engaging way, how can you actually change the selling experience that happens online? Or the second one here, one of my favorites, this is a very inelegant phrase, the digital exhaust. But if you think about a meeting like this, or any discussion you have with any supplier or any customer in the last few months, if you're doing that on a video app, if you are doing that by email or by text, you're generating a digital exhaust of duration, of speech patterns, of keywords, and so on. And companies that can tap into that, and we name Gong.io here as an example, but there are several. Companies that can tap into that and can analyze it can yield incredible insights, or have the potential to yield incredible insights for driving the effectiveness of your selling efforts going forward. What we think is going to happen is not the full replacement of the human, but evolving the role of the human to focus on the highest value elements, and a move from episodic metrics that measure performance to really using data to drive performance. So let's click back up a bit to the bigger picture for the imperatives of the post-pandemic enterprise. So look, before COVID, 92% of companies in our survey believed their business model was not economically viable through digitization. So whether that's an offensive statement or a defensive statement, it's a recognition that huge change was needed. And by our data, more than 85% of companies have something going on that they call the digital transformation. So that was 2019. Now, the other thing that characterized that, if we go to the next slide, reality is harder than revolution. So this was from some survey work that we did in December of 2019. And I would argue that that time period was peak cynicism for digital investments. 16% of companies reported that their transformations had fully succeeded, i.e. hit all their financial goals. And while many people were enthusiastic about what they had underway, and there were many public forums like this, people talking about the value of digitization, when you caught business executives or technology executives in private, you often got a different view. So a few quotes on the right that caught my eye from some of our conversations late last year. I can see the impact of digital everywhere except in my operating profit. Or I can see more pilots than an aircraft carrier, right? But how do I get these things to scale? Or one of my favorites, there's a big difference between digital natives who can change the company dress code and what it really, really takes to change a company culture. But that was pre-COVID. And then COVID came along. And of course, everything is changing. So on this slide that I won't walk through all of, if we just look at the last column in this slide, the next normal, we've got here just a very quick snapshot of the changes by industry that people are now talking about in the post-pandemic world. So in banking, branch networks shrinking more aggressively, not just transactions going online, but advice going online, cashless finally gaining steam. In retail, a giant transformation of grocery online, which in the past had been the hardest category to get right online. Consumer habits reset, as we talked about a few slides back. And in advanced industries and people who manufacture things, digital supply chains and what we call lights out digital manufacturing, that literally means the factory where you don't need to turn the lights on because it's all fully automated. So name your industry. In the last column here, we see a potential for a very different post-pandemic future. So how do you get there? So in our research of about 200 digital transformations and which ones succeeded and which ones didn't, we thought there are 6 elements that people needed to drive to get value from that digital transformation. So let me quickly recap what those are and talk a little bit about how they change post-pandemic. So the first one is a business-led technology roadmap. Right? This sometimes gets shorthanded as, well, you've got to start with a top-down strategy. And while strategy is a useful word, this is more detailed than a strategy. It actually is an aligned view by the senior business stakeholders of what the digital and technology investments really, really are. It's not enough for a CEO to say we want to do digital, and then for every business unit and every function to go and follow their own agenda. This needs to be aligned. And post-COVID, when we know resources are going to be tighter, you need to make sure that the best resources and the best talent are mapped against those priorities. And you need to make sure that the data and the worldview that you're basing it on reflects the post-COVID consumer and business behavior reality. Number 2 is talent. Now, everybody knows they need some of that scarce, magical digital native talent, but we also see a huge opportunity to rescale and retrain existing talent in companies. There's a great quote from the CEO of Tata Steel, the industrial company, who says that it's easier to take a metallurgist and turn them into a data scientist than it is to take a data scientist and turn them into a great metallurgist. And, maybe that's a little bit of an extreme example, but the idea of saying, how can you take the existing technical skills that you have in your organization and retrain them and redirect them towards digital, we see as being a tremendous opportunity and a key part of what should be in everybody's post-pandemic roadmap. Number 3, agile delivery. Right? Agile is probably one of the most overused words in business. And if you're listening to this, I can absolutely guarantee you've been involved in agile somewhere, and you probably have some agile squads and pods running in your organization. But what's hard and what's going to be critical post-pandemic is to get agile to really work at the enterprise level, not just in the technology teams, and to do it in a way where the business functions and also the control functions, legal, compliance, and the like, are fully at the table, so you can really have agile working broadly at the pace you need. Technology and tooling, I know other panelists and other speakers will talk a lot about that, and making sure you've got a technology base that allows you to do everything you need to with your talent, and it will feel more like being part of a modern software company rather than a traditional company for your employees. Data management. What we've seen is the key difference between companies that are able to move rapidly versus slowly in the digital transformation is often how well organized their data is. Often this is actually an organizational challenge more than it's a technology challenge. How can you actually create the data governance, the data operating model, the data ethical standards and the like that allow everybody in the company to leverage data as a competitive advantage rather than to spend enormous resources chasing it around the company. And finally on this slide, adoption and operating model change. Simply put, we think every company post-pandemic will need to be spending as much on adoption and operating model change as they are on technology. And if you're not doing that, you're unlikely to get full value out of the technology investments that you're making. So if we move on and we say, what does this really mean then for the role of the CIO or the CIO's team? So we published a paper in January of this year, so just when we were still debating whether we were in an epidemic or a pandemic, and we were talking about how the role of the CIO was changing. And we certainly believe that those changes have been accelerated in the post-pandemic world. So these are going to feel more like 2-year changes than the 4 or 5-year changes that we said in the paper. So first of all, obviously moving from the support function and the cost center that runs IT to the dual mandate, revenue driving, value creating, customer facing, right? The number of CIOs who will be spending time with customers has already increased and will continue to increase. Where the CIO reports, obviously this is a delicate conversation and depends a lot in different companies' contexts, but we're seeing more and more CIO directs to CEO reports rather than to COO or CFOs, and an increasing presence, whether it's formally on the board or ad hoc in the boardroom. And the reason for this is obvious. It's the clear increase in centrality in the role of technology in the business. In digital transformation, it's interesting to think about where this chief digital officer role came about. And many companies put in a chief digital officer role because they felt there was a need for someone who was focused on more modern technology, customer centricity, and building alignment with the business leaders. And that's the job description of many CDOs as opposed to CIOs. Now we're a little bit further on in digital transformation. I think it's fair to ask, if you're not doing those things, customer centricity, driving change, and aligning with modern technology, and aligning with the business leaders, then what are you doing as a CIO? So we actually see the CIO and the CDO roles increasingly coming together. Obviously, there'll be many situations where it's a general comment, and there'll be specific cases where it's not true. But we're seeing increasing alignment and certainly an increase in importance for the role of the CIO as being an owner or a co-owner of digital transformation, rather than focusing on the supporting plumbing and enabling infrastructure. And then on adoption, so rather than the CEO builds and the business adopts, we actually think the CIO is the chief influencing officer. How do you actually break down the silos and drive the adoption of digital products? How do you spend as much time on adoption as you do on technology, as per the description on the prior slide? And what does that mean about the future, where CEOs are going to come from? We have a view that CEOs who have often come from operations, finance, or commercial roles, we see CIOs as being contenders for those roles in the future. And at a minimum, we don't think there are going to be CEOs appointed of major corporations who are not actually tech savvy and able to talk technology with their customers and in the boardroom. So what does that mean about the behaviors and skills of the CIO? And this is I'll leave this slide as sort of as closing thoughts, that we can pick up more in the panel. So a CIO needs to be a business leader, a deep understanding of the business strategy, the critical growth drivers, and so on. It's still true that a CIO is a very portable role between companies, but if you're a CIO or on the CIO's team who've moved in from a different industry, it's critical that you understand the business drivers in your industry and not just the generalized technology driver. The change agents, we just talked about, the chief influencing officer, how to infuse technology into every strategy discussion rather than wait to hear the strategy and then say, what are the technology requirements? The talent scout. This is a world where great talent is going to be rarer and is going to be more valuable, and there's going to be a greater degree of caution on moving between companies. The ability of the CIO to focus on attracting and cultivating great talent, but also on not just retaining, but retraining the talent within your own company on technology is going to be extremely high. The culture revolutionary. It's not enough to talk about the digital natives and jeans and black t-shirts and so on, but how do you actually build a truly collaborative culture between IT, the business, and the control functions that is going to drive broad-scale change? And then finally, the CIO will continue to need to be the tech whisperer, not just the tech owner, but the tech whisperer who can influence and inform the business leaders and your customers and suppliers on the role of technology. So with that, thank you. We're going to make these slides available afterwards, and there's a few suggested links for anyone who wants to read further or watch further on this final slide. And thank you again, Alan, for the opportunity to be here. Well, hello, and thank you for staying with us to join this panel. I'm Rodney Zemmel. I lead McKinsey Digital globally. Let me quickly introduce my fellow panelists, and then we'll jump right into some questions. So I'll start by introducing Sebastian Grady. Sebastian's president of Rimini Street, and he's led global enterprise software firms and developed startups to success. And Rimini Street is a business that's focused on independent third-party enterprise software support. Next, I'll introduce Sandy Pentland, who's probably known to many of you. And Sandy is a professor and director of the MIT Media Lab. Sandy directs the MIT Human Dynamics Laboratory and the Media Lab Entrepreneurship Program. And he co-leads the World Economic Forum Big Data and Personal Data Initiative. And he was ranked one of the 7 most powerful data scientists in the world. I hear a rumor that the other 6 are all actually bots, so that might make it the most happy. Then I'll also introduce, in the hope that she will join us, I know she was running slightly late, April Sandoval. And April is the leader of data and analytics at Slack, where she's known for building motivated teams that span business and IT, and that help make analytics a competitive advantage. And pre-Slack, she had similar roles at Workday and a senior role at Cisco. And then last of all, I will introduce my friend and colleague, James Manyika, who's the chairman of the McKinsey Global Institute, which is our economics research arm, and James will be co-facilitating this panel with me. So with that, maybe I'll start with a fairly open-ended question, which is, if the topic is the post-pandemic enterprise, what resonated from the presentation, or maybe more broadly, what are the most significant changes that you see in the enterprise 2 years from now versus today? And maybe I'll ask Sandy to go first.
Okay, well, I'm going to concentrate on what I didn't hear in the presentation. Okay?
Perfect.
So one of the things that the pandemic showed us is that optimized systems, so things using AI, break whenever there's change. So, some of the best places in the world, Amazon, et cetera, broke horribly, and they were able by hand to sort of pull it back together. But this is a systematic problem in all of the machine learning AI techniques that are out there. And the class of techniques that deal with change is very different than what people typically call AI. It's more like optimal decision theory from a mathematical point of view, but it's really different. It's doing the best with the data that you have. In terms of the other sorts of things that I think probably weren't there, is there's increased need for data resources, both within the organization and outside. That's one of the things that sort of came out, which is that there's a lot of paper and a lot of things that are unknown because they're just not integrated yet. And what people typically have done is create data lakes. And what that does is it kills your company because of cyber attack. So one of the things people haven't talked about is that there's an order of magnitude increase in risk of cyber attack because everything's gone so digital. And the absolutely stupidest thing to do is to make a data lake, because when you put it in one place, that's where the bad guys go and you lose everything. So you need to come up with what's called federated data, which is leaving the data in the silos, but having the silos interoperate and ask questions and answers. And we've done this for Fidelity, for instance. We just spun up their systems to make them much more resilient to this, doing this with MasterCard, doing this with other sorts of people to help them get over it, because they really realize the cyber attack risk is going up. And on a slightly larger picture, what we see is all digital systems coming along. So instead of having paper systems and lawyers and stuff like that, we see these new logistics chains they're blockchain and stuff like that. But that's not what is important. What's important is they bring a new level of security. They're all digital. They're immensely more efficient and reliable than the existing systems. China is trying to get all of the Belt and Road countries and suppliers on board with this. Singapore has released their system. You should remember that they own good fractions of most of the telcos and banks in the Indian area. We just helped Swisscom and Switzerland spin up their version. They're going after the European market, of course. And you need to be aware of what's happening, because there's going to be lots more systems like this that are nationally backed end-to-end logistics systems that are all digital, high security, very, very different than the sorts of things that you see today. And very few companies are positioned well to do this. But I'd be willing to bet that 3 years from now, for instance, you'll see something like half of the trade in the world running on systems like this, because of the Chinese, because of the Swiss, because of the Singapore folks, and because of the people that will answer that.
That's great. Thank you. So I'll ask Sebastian's comment in just a second. Just before I do, just a reminder on the process here for our digital participants. We're going to have a discussion among the panel for about 20 minutes, and then we'll take questions from the audience, which you can submit through the chat function. So please, feel free to be thinking of your questions, and we'll pick them up in just a moment. But Sebastian, what did you think of the presentation? What do you think of the post-pandemic enterprise?
Sure, Rodney. Thank you so much. First of all, I really enjoy the relevancy of the research. It just seems to be spot on, and it gets to a level that a lot of other people don't get to. It just seems very real for me. The first thing that comes to my mind is the human element. Our human metal as human beings has never been tested like it's being tested today. We've got kind of this triple whammy. We have the pandemic. We have social justice that has never been addressed from human beings, at least in the United States and globally, like I've never seen in my lifetime. And we have in the next 2 months, probably the most hotly contested, vicious election that we've ever seen. And I'm sitting here in Oakland, California, working from home like most of you. And to add to that, we've got this double whammy of all these fires. It's 9 a.m. where I'm sitting, where I live. Take a look at my window outside.
Wow.
Doesn't that look like the apocalypse? I mean, this is 9 a.m. It's usually a bright, sunny day. It looks like it's 9 p.m. here. And it's almost impossible to see outside. It's like, kids are supposed to be going to school at this time, and everyone's sheltered in place, just wondering what's coming next. So we've really been tested. Now, from a frame of reference, I'm the president of a company called Rimini Street. We replace Oracle and SAP maintenance. That's 90+% of our revenue, and we're a $350 million company. When I joined 9 years ago, we were about a $20 million company, and we were just disrupting this whole idea that you could get your software maintenance from a company other than the original vendor. So I spend most of my time with CIOs. My frame of reference here is I think the situation is a little bit more dire than everybody wants to believe or the headlines are telling us. We talk to a lot of CIOs of retailers, of transportation companies, and right now you've got the government supplying unprecedented levels of monetary and fiscal stimulus. I believe globally it's up to $10 trillion, which is 3x what it was in the 2008 financial crisis. What happens when that slows down and that goes away? Are we going to be able to pick up where we left off? And that's an area that I'm very, very concerned about. I see a lot of employees in these companies that are quote unquote furloughed. So they're still employed, but they're not on the unemployment books. A lot of them are being laid off now. And there's some industries that are really, really being impacted. We see companies falling into maybe 3 different categories. The work from home companies that are thriving, the Microsofts, the Facebooks, the Googles, the Apples, the Amazons. We see that, of course, but that's a handful of companies. Most companies are what I see in this kind of stabilize mode. And then I see a bunch of companies in this what can I do to survive mode. And every one of these organizations is looking at their digital journey. But what they're trying to do is they're trying to prioritize what's going to make a difference, what's going to move the needle for my company. And when I say move the needle, it better increase my revenue, cut my costs, or take market share from my competitors. If it's not doing 1, 2, or 3 of those things, you better take it off the table and stop doing it. I love the quote that you mentioned with some of the CIOs, 16% have fully realized the digital transformation, albeit you said it was December 19, maybe at the peak of cynicism. But the quote where a CIO said, I've got more pilots than an aircraft carrier. People are really trying to figure out what digital means. Digital is extremely powerful, but it's such a big catch-all of stuff. And in this time of cash is king, You have to make decisions. So we sit down with companies and we talk about your 5 to 7 year application roadmap strategy. What are you trying to accomplish? Where are you trying to be? We start with this idea of helping them architect, if they don't have an architecture, of where they want to go and how they're going to get there. And in the post-pandemic enterprise and currently in the pandemic, this is a very different world than it was when people were partying like it was 1999, if you will. So very tough decisions are being made. And I'll leave it at that for now.
Okay, thank you. James, you add that?
Yeah, well, I was going to build on Sebastian. Sebastian, you and I are seeing the same window outside. I'm in San Francisco, so I'm seeing much of the red apocalyptic sky that you're seeing. But I wanted just to pick up on the human element that you talked about quite a bit, just to maybe paint a fuller picture of that, in the sense that if we look at an economy like the United States, something like about a third of workers are actually vulnerable in the following sense: they've either been laid off, they've been furloughed, they're seeing reduced work hours, or their wages have been cut back. So that's a much larger number than the purely unemployment number. The reason why that number is larger is worth thinking about. It also has an impact on even how we use our digital infrastructure in the following sense. We know that of all the workers out there, now we all maybe have the luxury right now on this Zoom to be able to work remotely, but only about, again, another third of workers can actually work remotely. The rest of the workforce actually has to show up someplace in order to actually do the work. And the 2/3 that can't show up that have to show up someplace right now either can't show up because their sector's shut down, either in the restaurant business or someplace like that, or it's actually physically not safe for them to be there, or they have to they show up only because they're actually essential workers. So the picture of the worker landscape is actually very important, because CIOs who are having to create the digital infrastructure to support different kinds of workers who are having to work in very different environments, are having very different experiences. If you're a CIO in a hospital system, as some of you I suspect on this call are, your challenges involve not just the classic IT infrastructure challenges, but having to provide also other intelligence systems that are required to make the hospital work safely. So I think the human picture is an important part to keep in mind as well. And I think part of that has also had an implication on two other things. As people work from home, I think the nature of the IT architecture itself has had to shift. So there's been a whole period of thinking about campus networks and campus networking infrastructure. Well, if people are working from home, the access points are different. The infrastructure required to support that is quite different. And CIOs are having to deal with that different architecture and requirements for that. It also has changed the nature of the cybersecurity threat landscape as well, because while people might have spent an enormous amount of time protecting the enterprise accessed and used in a certain way, well, when people are using multiple access points, working in very different locations, using very different infrastructure to access that, that has also changed the cybersecurity threat landscape. So all of that, I think, are additional challenges that CIOs are having to think about as well as deal with. So I wanted just to add that, Rodney, to the
Thank you.
that you laid out.
And just a quick update for the audience here. So we've heard, continuing, I guess, with the apocalyptic theme, that April Sandoval is actually located in a fire risk area, and we believe she may have lost power just before the panel. So we, of course, hope she and everyone else is okay. But we'll continue. Sandy, just given the discussion we just had around how the world is changing, I guess maybe in some cases be too early to talk post-pandemic, sort of through the pandemic, how do you see the role of the CIO, or maybe of technology leadership more broadly, changing in a large enterprise?
Well, the general thing is that there's the management of this enterprise, right? This sort of IT enterprise. And what's happening there is, I think, first of all, a new generation of infrastructure is coming on that's inherently distributed. And that's this sort of systems being floated by Singapore, Swisscom, people like that. And you'll see much more of that around. What James was talking about is, of course, also the new reality, is that the human dimension of this is going to be radically different, particularly as in the last panel talk about ideation. Ideation doesn't work well over Zoom at all. And so organizations need to have some sort of in-person, probably mixed in-person and home. And that raises a whole bunch of management issues that people really haven't had to deal with before. People at home were typically people who had sort of fixed little jobs, and you could put them in a little bucket. And now it's going to be everybody trying to do that, at least part way. I think the biggest thing is just what Sebastian was saying, and James, is we've only seen the beginning of this pandemic. What we're going to see is an enormous hit for any community that isn't sort of either fully virtual or a owner of productive capital, which means owner of stocks in companies that work, owner of real estate, things like that. So that the sort of financial distress that's been provoking a lot of what's been happening in terms of protests and so forth, I think is going to get worse. And that's actually sort of independent of what the governments do to some extent. What historically happens when national debt gets this high is nations have to hold interest rates down because they can't afford to pay interest on it. And there's all these additional expenses supporting people who are out of work, new infrastructure, new ways of doing things. And so actual inflation goes up even though the CPI won't budge, because the CPI has to be engineered to be low because otherwise the government can't pay for it, right? So in that sort of environment, people who have just salary, people who are on fixed income, people who are savers lose big. And the only people that do well are the ones that are in control of productive outputs. What that means is that the two-path society is almost locked in at this point. And so that changes a lot of the way we think about things. And what I'm trying to do is get people to think about investing in these underserved communities and trying to help them own their own infrastructure in various ways. This is not quite the CIO's problem, but it's the C-level problem. This is like, who are your customers? How are they going to be able to afford your customers? How is your customers' customers going to be able to stay in business? Like, for instance, I do a lot of work with MasterCard. If all those small businesses go out of business, it means that they're in real trouble. And if they go out of business, the government's in trouble because there's no tax income and you have to support people and feed them. And so companies, for their own good, right, need to think about how can they build a broader base in terms of socioeconomic terms for what they do. And you see this in different parts of the world where some companies have strategies for reaching out to small businesses, to individual customers that are much more nuanced and higher trust than just advertising. And we could have a whole thing about that. So how do you reach your customers? I think that the business of not talking to sales guys is an example of wrong-headedness. No, nobody wants, in a B2B thing, you don't want to do that right now. But if you're talking about end customers, talking to a human is critical now. All this stuff about chatbots and stuff, if you're relying on that, you're in deep trouble. No one's going to use you.
Sammy, just one clarification question. Near the beginning of your comments, you made a couple of references to a distributed technology model with Singapore as an example. Can you just say a little bit more about what you have in mind there?
Well, one of the key things here is that you need lots of data resources to be able to operate. As a company, you may not own all of those. So that means you have to come up with some way of working with people who do have those things. And people aren't going to give you their data. They might answer questions for you, but they're not going to give you your data. So you leave the data where it is and you set up cooperations for insights across things. That's a whole different way of doing AI. It's a whole different way of doing infrastructure. Interestingly, you see this going in Europe because being driven by GDPR. In GDPR, you can't share data very often, right? But you can answer questions. So setting up question and answering systems, and that's of course what we do with a number of people, is sort of key to this. And it's a very different way to think about IT. It has different properties. A lot of the standard things don't work. One of the key things is because you're not copying data everywhere, your cyber risk profile drops dramatically. And by using this sort of, I'll use the word blockchain, but basically very secure networks for doing insight transfer and insight sharing, you can audit what's happened, you can find cyber attacks, you can actually optimize your operations much better. So for instance, when I used to chair AT&T's big data board, we moved to a very different architecture, and just from internal savings, this sort of distributed internal thing, we were able to save almost $1 billion a year. That's pretty phenomenal. That's real money, right? And other companies, I think, need to begin thinking about that as opposed to let's centralize everything. It's really more how do we get things work together.
Interesting.
Yeah.
So Sebastian, let me give you a chance to comment also on the evolution of the CIO or the technology leadership role question as well.
But I wasn't surprised to hear you saying that more CIOs are reporting to CEOs. It's an interesting time, and I think this also translates a little bit to your B2B selling comment. If you think about the buyers and the sellers in this pandemic world, somebody posted in the webinar chat here, I think it was Alan, Rahm Emanuel said, never let a good crisis go to waste, right? Unfortunately, in some ways, many technology B2B salespeople have gotten reputations as used car salesmen. And you're going to have so many ambulance chasing pandemic vendors that will have your cure or elixir to whatever's going on in your company that's bad. And as a CIO, and I know there's a lot on this call, they'll really appreciate this, they've got to be able to separate the wheat from the chaff. And as a seller in this environment, I think you have to be a great listener. You can't just come in to every client and regurgitate the same value proposition, and because it might not be pertinent to them. You can't just come in and show up and throw up. You really have to listen to what's driving this company, what their pain points are, and tailor your offering to meet their needs. And by the way, if there's not a fit, walk away. Don't waste their time. Don't waste your time. But CIOs are really going to appreciate those sellers and those companies that can come up with true value propositions that are going to help them, and they're actually going to work. They're going to be able to talk to other companies that have done this, other companies in their industries that have solved the same problems that you're telling them you can help them solve using your software or your services or your capabilities. So I think it's a very challenging time for a CIO. While the first panel talked about people going from 2,000 VPNs to 20,000 VPNs in a 2-week period, just to take care of the productivity, efficiency, and work and safety of your own employees. So CIOs, first of all, had to get that in line. I think they've done a pretty good job of doing that, and they've done it very quickly. And personally, I'm a person that used to travel 50% of the time. I think I have close to 3 million miles on American Airlines. I kind of like this. I don't miss the travel much. I like this work from home quite a bit. Sometimes we can get on each other's nerves because we're all in the same household. As a family, we love each other, but sometimes we don't like each other. Those are comments that you see happening. I've got a couple kids that one's a senior in high school, one's a senior in college. She just went back to live at Northwestern, but she's not going to have classes in person. So this is a little bit of a challenge for kids these days. Kids growing up in all this social unrest that we're seeing, and not being able to go to classrooms. Like, could you imagine if when we were 17, 18, 19, 20 years old, if we had to deal with this, what we would do? So, the next generation of leaders are going to be the people that these CIOs look to. And they're really going to have to understand what makes them tick, because they're going to drive the future of these companies. And I greatly appreciate everything James and Sandy said as well, but I'll stop.
Right.
Yeah,
James?
actually, I was going to pick up on a related point, Sebastian, maybe with a question for you, Sandy and Rodney. I mean, all of you see a lot of CIOs in very different kinds of companies and very different kinds of sectors. I guess the question that I would love to hear your reflections on this is, how does it look differently for CIOs in different sectors? I have to imagine if you are the CIO in a hotel chain right now, your chances are very different because there probably isn't a whole lot going on, given that that sector is down, versus if you are an online retailer where everything is kind of exploding and you probably have more demand than you could imagine. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the differences by sector that you see, just given that they're each going through very different dynamics right now, both on the customer demand side, but also even the profile of the work and workers that they have, whether they're all at home or still showing up somewhere. Talk a little bit about the sectoral differences that you see.
Rodney, I could jump into this.
Go ahead. Go right ahead, Sebastian.
Sure. So, let's take automobile manufacturers and the whole automobile supply chain. You have a situation where you have a ton of workers that I won't say are doing nothing, but they're kind of planning for what's going to happen when people start buying cars again and start increasing in the transportation industry, let's say airlines. But essentially right now, a lot of these workers are twiddling their thumbs, trying to figure out how to be productive and try to stay efficient. You could put them in the survive or stabilize category versus the thrive category, James, that you mentioned for an online retailer. And it's a whole different story for them. I mean, it's a really, really challenging world. The number one thing that I'm seeing is, remember, we work in big enterprise resource planning software. Let's take SAP and Oracle software is run by probably every Fortune 500 company in the world. So my conversations are with CIOs of generally billion-dollar plus companies, companies that are probably the biggest and the best out there. By the way, Fortune magazine just published their Global 500, and you guys were mentioning China earlier, but this is the first year in 30 years where China has more companies in the Global Fortune 500 than the United States does. I think it's like 133 to 121. So, there's a sign of the times. Lots of things are changing. I think, the stance that we take in the United States on global trade is going to be extremely interesting. James, I know you spent a lot of time in Obama's administration, and I could say you're an expert in this area. But I think, the choices that we make are going to be very, very interesting moving forward, and it's going to impact our future as a global leader.
Yeah, I mean, I do a lot of work with a thing called the World Leaders Alliance, which is all the people that have gotten out of office. So Clinton, Blair, people like that. They're looking to establish a new framework for this. And it'll likely be for international collaboration, international commerce. And it'll likely be very heavily digital. So instead of the big deliberative processes of the World Bank or the IMF, It may look a lot more like digital payment networks, that sort of a thing. Most of the CIOs I work with are in emergency mode where core business of their company is no longer viable. And they have to redo what it is they're doing it and how they're doing it. If you're in retail, you're beginning to think about, okay, now I really have to be online. That's going to be the major thing. How am I going to compete with Amazon? How am I going to compete with Walmart, right? And supporting those sorts of transformations is the thinking that I see people doing. Of course, this is my business, is helping people not with today, but with next year or the year out. And a lot of people are, as you said, they're sort of on life support. Auto companies are a really good example of that, where, yeah, they're making cars, but it's been overcapacity forever. A lot fewer miles are going to be driven, most certainly. A lot of pressure, of course, to make that all electric, but nobody's buying electric yet. What's going to happen? And companies are placing very different bets in that sort of thing. And the CIO has to be the one that makes it actually something that happens, just as much or more than any of the other people, like the CFO or so forth.
James, the only thing I'd add, just super quick on your question, is I actually don't think it varies that much by industry in one important regard, right? I think what Sandy and Sebastian are saying is the CIO needs to be at the table shaping the future direction of the business, right? It's the CIO as chief influencing officer notion that we talked about in the presentation. Now, your industry will set the context for that, right? So if you're doing that in an airline or if you're doing that in a grocer right now, right, you're in an extremely different context, and that will affect your budget flexibility, the investment you can make, essentially whether you're in growth mode or whether you're in completely reinvent business mode. But either way, you need to be right there at the table shaping the direction of the company with the CEO and the rest of the leadership team.
Yeah, no, that's helpful. Maybe we could also go to a question I think that Sebastian, you alluded to, which is, we are living through extraordinary times with social unrest. But one of the things that I think this COVID moment is also exposed is perhaps the role that digital technology can play to both help close some of those inequality gaps, but it could also exacerbate them and make them look worse. I live in California, as you do, Sebastian, and one of the things that we're seeing across California is that more communities have had to rely on online access for just about everything, whether it's schooling, shopping, etc. And we've suddenly realized that, in fact, we thought we had solved the digital access divide, but actually we haven't, because a lot of people don't actually have access. So any of you have any thoughts on how could we make sure that in this COVID moment, digital technologies actually help address some of these gaps as opposed to make them worse?
Sure. I actually, have an initiative in this area. So, that thing you just said used to be they would replace sort of digital access with electricity. There was a time in the 30s, 40s, and even into the 50s when many of these communities didn't have adequate electricity. And the thing that got them through that and provided electricity almost everywhere was local cooperatives, communities constructing financing to deploy their own infrastructure. In the United States, 56% of all of the electric grids by area were done by co-ops and not by government. Think about that. So that's just like internet, right? Communities can build a financial cooperative to cause themselves to have productive assets. And that's the thing you need to do in this low interest rate, high inflation environment. You need to own those. The community needs to own those. And so making that sort of cooperative and administering, making that really easy through digital technology, I think is an enormous opportunity, both for the communities, but also for the people that help them set it up. And they will use services, of course.
Yeah, I'll add to that. I do think this is the first time I've seen in my life where the haves are really concerned with helping the have-nots. Almost to a very serious and not just, I support what they do, but I'm going to do nothing about it myself. Here in Oakland, California, I've never seen a community rally together to try to do the right thing and actually, step out of their boxes and stand side by side and talk about challenges and opportunities that we're facing in our society today. It feels good. It feels right. I hope it's not another flash in the pan. I hope it's the beginning of something that will be long lasting and will make not just the United States, but the world a much better place.
Yeah, I think that you should think of this time as being rather like the end of World War II, which was another time with high debt, destruction everywhere. And I think that a lot of the answer came through enabling communities to control their future, to be able to build out the infrastructure they needed. So that's my bet. I hope that happens.
I think that's probably a good optimistic note to end on. I think we went from the post-pandemic enterprise to the post-pandemic world, but this notion of communities and distributed approaches, I think, was a theme that ran through the panel. So thank you, Sandy. Thank you, Sebastian. Thank you, James. And of course, we hope April is okay. And thank you, participants, for your questions and for listening. And thank you, Alan, for having us on.
Well, thanks to all of you. That was a very interesting panel. I enjoyed it a lot. And of course, we do hope that April is okay. As Rodney says, it seems that she lost power due to fires. We'll get some updated information out about that. And also a big call out to Rodney for preparing that presentation, as well as James, the two of you, for preparing for this panel as moderators. It's very much appreciated. And also thanks to all of you, the audience. We appreciate you coming and hope you'll join us again next month. So in the meantime, find us on social media. You can find us at facebook.com/MITCIO. You can find us on Twitter at MITCIO. We also have a LinkedIn company page for the MIT Sloan CIO Symposium. And you can find all the videos on YouTube on the MIT Sloan CIO Symposium channel. And this video will be posted within 2 weeks. And I do hope that you join us on October 14 for episode number 5. We will have 2 panels and a fireside chat. Panel number 1 will be the digital transformation on the fast track, moderated by Mike Grananetti. The panel number 2 will be building a digital ready culture in traditional organizations with one of our old favorites, George Westerman. And finally, I will do a fireside chat with Guy Snodgrass talking about leadership in times of crisis. Don't forget to fill out our survey. Enjoy the rest of your week, and bye for now.